Greetings everyone, this is National Chess Master Jonathan Hilton, here today with another Ford Chess moment. This moment comes from the book Mastering Complex Endgames by Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. Naroditsky wrote this book when he was 16 or 17 years old. It was published when he was 18. And Naroditsky is an incredible chess talent and perhaps the youngest chess player to have ever been published in history, because his first book came out when he was 14. This particular book covers some very difficult endgames. They aren't theoretical in the sense of they're not positions that anyone would ever memorize, but I think they have a lot to offer in terms of the creativity and the dynamic play that you find in them. So I want to jump to a position that I have bookmarked. And this position is, I'll go ahead and put it up on the big screen. It is from an absolutely wild endgame. In this position, white is playing on the queen side, black is playing in the center, and he's trying to promote his f-pawn. If you look carefully, you will notice that white is up material. He has an extra exchange, but when you think about black's 3 pawns in the center, although I think most players would instinctively prefer to play white here, and for good reason. Black has some very strong counterplay. So white has just played the move pawn to b4, and black, of course, logically proceeds with pawn to f2. And the question here is how white should proceed. I'll go ahead and hide the move that white played, and if you want, you can pause your video for a while. Take 10, 15, even 20 minutes to try to calculate this and see if you can come up with the best move for white. Okay, ready? So in this position, in the actual game, white played king to b2. Naroditsky assigns this move a dubious annotation with a question mark and then the exclamation point. And Naroditsky would have preferred the more direct king to b3, and we'll go over why that's the case in a moment. But so when white played king to b2, black played rook to b8, attacking the b4 pawn. White played king to a3, and now black has a chance to activate his king with king to d4. This could end up essentially neutralizing all of white's play fairly quickly. For instance, a6, trying to promote the pawn, black plays rook to b6, white plays pawn to a7, and then black plays rook to a6, check, king b2, knight d6, and black has sufficient counterplay here to ensure that he is going to round up the pawn on a7, and he'll be able to make a draw. So if we just go back, this tells us why the move king to b2 is inaccurate. So what should white have played according to Naroditsky? Well, Naroditsky says that the more active king to b3 is the most accurate move. Ostensibly, white didn't play this because black could now play pawn to f1 queens with the idea of rook takes f1, knight d2 check, winning the exchange. However, as Naroditsky points out, after king to a4, knight takes f1, rook takes f1, white is actually winning. His pawns on a5 and b4 are so advanced at this point, and black's pawns on e6 and d5 just really aren't getting that far. So this position, winning for white, even though you probably couldn't calculate this position to the end, if you saw this position over the board, you would notice how much more advanced white's pawns are and conclude that white has good winning chances. However, this isn't the end of the analysis. After king to b3, black has actually a very strong move, rook to a8. The point of this is to simply stop the advance of the white pawns. White obviously can't just march his pawns forward with a6 or b5 because this would drop the a pawn at this point. So what would white play? Well, king to a4 is the logical move. White is trying to support his b pawn to run down the board. But here, black has a very powerful idea. He starts marching his d-pawn with pawn to d4, and now when white plays pawn to b5, black plays d3. So you see black's mechanism of creating counterplay. He's marching his d-pawn and his f-pawn down the board. Now white plays king to b4. White simply wants to avoid a situation where black is going to bring his pawn to d2 and then play knight to c3 check. And of course, this would allow black to control the d1 square and promote his pawn. So king to b4 is the most logical move. But here black has an incredible resource. If you want, you can pause the video for a minute and try to figure out what black can play to generate counterplay again. Remember, white is very close to just marching his b-pawn down and creating a queen, so black really needs to take some dramatic steps for counterplay. Okay, ready? Black's resource here is the astounding rook to c8. Naroditsky gives this move 2 exclamation points, and I think that it deserves it, because this would be a very hard move to see. Black is sacrificing his rook in order to challenge white's control of the first rank, where black is trying to queen his pawns. If white were to play rook takes c8, black would play pawn to d2, threatening to queen. White would play rook to d8, and then black has knight to d6. This effectively cuts off the communication between white's rook on d8 and that black pawn on d2. So black is going to queen his d-pawn and win the game here. So if we go back, black has just played rook to c8, and white cannot accept the rook sacrifice. So instead, white would play rook to d1. I think this makes perfect sense because white is trying to stay on the offense too. He is attacking the black pawn on d3. So here, rook to c2 is a very strong move for black. Black is trying once again to just drum up some counterplay and to activate all of his pieces. It doesn't have an immediate threat, however, so this does allow white time that white needs in order to move the a pawn down the board with pawn to a6. Black plays rook to b2 check. Again, just trying to drum up some counterplay. King to c4, I think, is the most logical move for white. Just trying to continue the fight. Now black plays knight to d6 check, forking the king on c4 and the rook on f7. White plays king to c3, attacking black's rook on b2. So black obviously wouldn't want to play knight takes f7 here, because after king takes b2, black really doesn't have a good way to continue to advance his pawns, whereas white's a6 pawn is going to make a queen very shortly. So instead of knight takes f7, black would play rook takes b5. And here, white is able to snap off black's pawn with rook takes f2. Knight to e4 check, forking the king on c3 and the rook on f2. White plays king to c4. So we've seen this yet again. Black is forking white's king and white's rook, but white is using his king to attack and pester black's rook. Rook to c5 check, stepping out of the way. King to b4. Again, black's knight on e4 seems tied down to the rook on c5. And this again is another very key moment. If you would like, at this point, you can pause your video and try to figure out how black can actually save this game. It is possible. Okay, ready? Black plays knight takes f2. White plays king takes c5. Black plays knight takes d1. white plays pawn to a7. So you see white is about to promote, and it looks like this is completely hopeless for black. However, here black has the resource, pawn to d2, white queens, and then after this, black is able to play knight to f2, or as Naroditsky points out, it could just be knight to c3, but let's stick with the move knight to f2. Here in this position, black is threatening to play pawn to d1 queens, and white has absolutely nothing that he can do about this except to make a perpetual check. Or actually, sorry, it's not a perpetual check, it's just white has to go ahead and initiate the draw. He's going to play queen to h8 check, black plays king to e4, white plays queen to d4 check. Of course, it looks like this is time to resign for black because white's going to snap off the pawn on d2, but it's not so easy. Black plays king to f3, queen takes d2, and of course, black comes back with knight to e4 check. After king to d4, knight takes d2, white would play king to e5, and white is going to take that black pawn on e6, so the game is drawn. So, where does this leave us? Well, this was just one variation in a much larger game, and it just shows kind of the brilliance that Naroditsky has, I think, for coming up with these very ingenious variations. And I think it really highlights the complexity of the endgames that he tackles. I hope that you learned something, particularly about the nature of just how much in these complex endgames both sides have to struggle to create counterplay, and really the depth of some of the calculation that, in order to play very accurately, players have to undertake. So thank you very much, and I will see you again on the next Forward Chess Moment.